Hello and welcome to the Game Changers podcast, where you'll hear from trailblazing women in sport who do so much to drive change and challenge the status quo for women and girls across society. I'm Sue Anstis, and I'd like to start with a big thank you to our partners Sport England, who support the Game Changers through a National Lottery Award. In this special one-off episode, I'm sharing a roundup of some of the highlights from 2022. Think of it as a small taster menu where you can sample the delights of the last few series and then go back to listen to the episodes in full. First up, Paralympian Hannah Cockcroft talked about being an advocate for all wheelchair users. Having not wanted to be in your wheelchair as a young girl, you shared such a powerful post on International Day of the Wheelchair, and you said, after years growing up and avoiding one, I hope my life shows people that wheelchairs are nothing but a mobility aid, helping over 110 million people worldwide work hard and achieve their dreams. So clearly it's really important for you to raise that profile for the challenges wheelchair users face. But how important is it in terms of that day-to-day access, in terms of transport and, being out on high streets, just living life, really?
Yeah, I think that that's more important to me than anything. Because I think people look at us as elite athletes and they go, oh, they don't have the same difficulties as I do day to day. And the thing is, if that shop doesn't have a ramp, then I'm not getting in it just as much as an everyday person isn't getting in it. I haven't got as much as a profile, but I have an opportunity to actually raise that and say this isn't right. And I also want to change the way people see a wheelchair. I know that I was so terrified of it. It had such a negative connotation growing up that I avoided it. And actually, had I not avoided it, how different would my life have been? How much more would I potentially have been able to do? I'll never know the answer to that, but I hate to think that there are people, again, like me out there thinking, oh, I can't be in a wheelchair, it makes me different. Because ultimately, it doesn't. It just makes you more able to do things.
Next, in a fascinating conversation with Radha Balani from Beyond Sport, we addressed the issues of anxiety, depression, and eating disorders in WSL footballers.
And we saw some really sad research last week that highlighted a significant, often hidden prevalence of anxiety, depression and eating disorders amongst female footballers competing in WSL and the Championship. So do you feel we're doing enough to protect the mental well-being of elite sportswomen and men?
I think you could just take away the profession for a moment and just consider these people as optimum performers. And if we consider it from that perspective, I'm not sure that any businesses have got it quite right. So we consider them as people working at the highest level in what they do. How does that predispose them to these things? And what can we do to then put in place a set of support networks that allow them to be safe? I think sport, as much as it's saying it is in a different place with this, I'm not sure that it's necessarily living up to it. I still think there are still beliefs that you can't let anything get in the way of performance and that performance is everything. I don't know. It's a really good question, Sue. It's a really good question. I wonder whether actually my answer is I just don't think anyone's good enough at it because it's so complex. Can we create conditions where everyone can be themselves on a good day, bad day, and indifferent day? And when it's bad, what can we do? Maybe it's more simple than I think.
And talking about it too, isn't it? I think that although the research made me really sad when I saw it, at least it's out there and we're perhaps having that conversation and people recognising they're not alone in their bubble of where they exist.
And recognising what sits behind that. What sits behind an eating disorder has nothing to do with food, right? Why are some of our young footballers trying to seek control from elsewhere? And is the football environment, the elite football environment, causing them to feel as though they have no agency over their life, so they're going to take control here? Those are the big questions that actually need to be spoken about. And those are the ones that people don't want to talk about. It's really easy to turn an eating disorder into something that's about food and weight when it's nothing to do with that.
We brought together a powerful panel of experts to explore the issues of women's sports kit. Wendy Taylor from the Youth Sport Trust shared some shocking stats about how periods and clothing affect girls' participation in school sport, before Rimla Akhtar shared her personal experience of clothing bans. Finally, why are women still wearing dresses to play sport? GB hockey player and sportswear activist Tess Howard enlightens us.
Just looking at the stats from the past few years in terms of girls' participation and the barriers they tell us. So periods has gone from being the sort of third barrier to the biggest barrier to their participation. So of the 6,000 plus girls that we surveyed this last academic year, 39% of them told us that, when they have their period, that stops them participating. So we know how much of an issue that is for girls in the PE space. I think if you then overlay that with having to wear a kit that you feel on show uncomfortable, among the top concerns were concerns about leaking, having low self-confidence, self-consciousness in the changing rooms, and the worry that others will know when they're on their period. So it's a huge issue.
Just want to follow up with another point about rugby, about how good and inclusive rugby has been in terms of allowing the hijab and women to play and people to play in all kinds of kits. So what do you think in terms of the FIFA ban on the hijab as was, and now in other sports too? Where's the difference? Why is it okay in rugby, but it's not okay? Is there still a ban in basketball? There certainly was, wasn't there?
No, there was. So FIFA were the first ones to outright ban the hijab and any religious headgear in sport, but obviously the hijab took sort of the headlines, as it were, because it had such an immediate impact on millions of girls across the world. But as soon as FIFA, we managed to overturn the ban there, and all that hard work over 7 years to get that overturned, FIBA in their intelligence decided to initiate a ban in basketball, and actually devastated at least 2 women that I know that wanted to go professional and were good enough to go professional, absolutely. When FIBA put the ban in place, that's where I kind of got this sense of, for goodness sake, we're going to have to go through this again, this whole kind of challenging the ban. And we did overturn it again, largely due to Bilqis Abdul Qadir, who's this amazing basketballer, like I say, from America, who wanted to go professional. But there are so many other sports. I mean, it's great, Keith, that we've got the hijab in rugby that's allowed and specifically mentioned. I think, I'm guessing here, the fact that someone like Zainab, who plays rugby union, is in the sport, can advocate for that, helps along the way. What I would like is for the rules to just not be restrictive, so that if and when somebody from a different background, or a girl that chooses to dress in a different way, wants to enter a sport, she has the opportunity. She doesn't immediately come up with a barrier. And I guess from a religious headgear and the hijab ban's perspective, one of the things I'm currently trying to work on in my so-called spare time is really around working proactively with sports to look at their kits and say, how can you be more inclusive here? And specifically around the hijab, but just generally as well. How can we make sure that no other sport puts a ban in place, whether it's the hijab or the burkini, whatever it might be, that stops women from every background taking part? And I need some legal support with that, or someone that understands all this stuff. So if anyone wants to help out, please let me know. But that's what needs to be done in terms of action. We need to change the rules at the international federation level, because that is what trickles down right down to club level.
What you're doing is fantastic, Rimla. So yeah, power to you, and we'll spread the word for more support too there. And we know historically that women's sport's always been considered as more acceptable, hasn't it? If we're dressing femininely, what we traditionally might have considered femininely, and wearing skirts and skirts and so on. So Tess, it's fantastic to hear about the work you're doing in hockey. What's general opinion in terms of that, of playing in dresses, and the same for netball?
There's such an interesting part. It's where my whole interest came from, was why do we still wear skirts, and why is that the legacy? And as soon as you understand why, you're immediately put off by what the reasons are. Acceptability in sport, as you said, for women has come from femininity, and you have to understand where femininity comes from. It's docility, it's submissiveness, it's to look a certain way, it's around physique, it's around appearance, behavior. So feminine itself, has so much baggage to it that it creates almost a paradox when you put it together with sport, which is traditionally the masculine. But then again, if you understand what masculine traditionally means, it means strong, powerful, dominant, aggressive, dare I say. And so when you have these two conflicting forces, that makes it very difficult for a woman to exist in this space. And that's called the athletic feminine identity paradox. And that is why there are so many tensions in sports so if you look at the way rugby and football were traditionally conceived of as women invading men's sports, whereas hockey and netball have been kind of, feminized by the skirt or the dress. So my big interest is, okay, now we're in the 21st century. Do we still need to feminize sports for us to be able to play them? And I ask these questions to my teammates. I say, why do we still wear skirts? And they say, well, we just look nicer. It's more professional. It's like, and I'm like, do you really think that? Or is that your social internalization of culture? And I think it is the latter, because no one grows up thinking it's a certain way unless you're told it's a certain way. That's socialization.
Sue Day is now Head of Operations and Finance at the RFU. The former England captain had 59 caps for her country, and she spoke to me about being an LGBTQ plus woman in rugby. You were playing rugby in the 80s and 90s when society wasn't as progressive as it is today. So what was your experience like being an LGBTQ woman in rugby?
That's a really good question. The honest answer is that it was easier to be an LGBTQ woman in rugby than not in rugby. It was a really inclusive space to be. I found rugby, the rugby club, to be that space where it was okay to be who you wanted to be, where you didn't have to hide who you were, or you didn't feel like you had to hide who you were, where I certainly always felt supported by my teammates, by coaches, by people around me. So I appreciate that can be, that experience can be really different for different people in different sports, certainly different, it's certainly harder for men in sports rather than women often to be out. But my experience was that it was such a welcoming, inclusive place to be.
How do you feel about sport today? I kind of have my own positive opinions, as a mother of a rugby playing daughter, but what are your thoughts in terms of how the sport is today?
In terms of inclusivity, I think the first thing to say is there is always more to do. If you think you're in a team sport or any sport and you think you've made it, if you think you've done enough to include people, then, you're wrong. There is always more to do. I personally think rugby is in a relatively good place. I generally find rugby clubs inclusive places, and I generally find rugby people open to thinking about how to make them more inclusive. I appreciate all of those generalisations. We know there is always more work to do in every club in the land, within England rugby, everywhere. We have to constantly be striving to be better. And we've never made it.
In an incredibly moving conversation with Kelly Lindsay, the former head coach of the Afghanistan women's football team, tells me about the process of creating a national team and what football meant to Afghan women.
And so we said we'd give it a try. First of all, we'd go around the world and try to find Afghan players who could help lead the women's team to really become successful on the international level. So our goal was nationalism will trump sexism in the country. So how do we build a successful team that the men of Afghanistan will be proud of? Because if they're proud of a sports team, it doesn't matter if they're men or women. If someone's winning, suddenly countries buy into female sports. So that was our mission and that was our goal. And we came together, and it was a long project to get it started, but Halida and I hit it off, and then we kept bringing staff in, and it just sort of escalated into something quite beautiful and quite powerful for the women, which was way bigger than I ever imagined. Football is football, sport is sport, but it does transform lives.
And tell us about how important it was to the women that were still in Afghanistan that were playing. How did playing football affect them and their lives?
Yeah, women, especially at that time, they weren't really free to walk on the street. If they were wearing sports clothing, they had rocks thrown at them, stones thrown at them. They were called prostitutes. They were just not really allowed to be their true self, not allowed to live their free life. They couldn't go anywhere without a man to walk them there, to protect them, whether it was their brother or their uncle or their father. They just lived such a sheltered life. And football was a vision for them to do a couple things: to prove that women were real human beings, to prove to the rest of their country, to prove to men in their country, to prove to women in their country that women were strong, that they had value, that they had a future, that they should get an education. It really was like a spark for many things.
Dr. Emma Ross reflects on her work at the English Institute of Sport and why sports science is currently failing our female athletes.
Do we think we support our athletes as well as we can? And obviously the answer that comes back first is, well, of course, Emma, look at these amazingly successful female athletes that we have. You know, we were just off the back of the Jess Ennis era. And so I said, okay, well, let's think about how we can ask this a different way. What do you do differently with female athletes? And people are like, well, okay, Emma, female athletes have spent a long time trying to get the same as men, you know, the same pay, the same media coverage, the same facilities, the same access to good coaches, the same, you know, like the same quality of kit, all of that, which is still a journey, by the way, we're not there. So you can't come in here and say we need to do something differently for these girls, because that's exactly what they've been sort of rallying against. So I was like, okay, this is going to, you know, I'm going to have to dismantle this a bit. So I kind of just went back to my roots as a physiologist and said, okay, the physiology of a female body is different from that of a male body. You know, we have a menstrual cycle, for example. Those hormones change our physiology massively. We have periods that we need to manage. We have breast tissue that we need to support in some way. And I started to sort of gather this list of things that either happens exclusively in a female body or that happens differently in a female body who's being trained and prepared for high performance. And that was my sort of compelling case to say, if you can tell me we're considering all of these things and we've created an environment where women can show up and talk about all of these things, then I will leave you be and say it's not our problem, it's somewhere down the pathway. But actually no one was doing, you know, a fraction of the things on that list. No one was even acknowledging that they existed. And actually we'd done a pretty good job of pretending that girls don't have periods. We don't talk about their breasts or their pelvic floors. We just kind of silence or ignore that so that we can concentrate on these women being powerful and strong and sporty, which we need to. But how much opportunity were we missing by ignoring the bits of our female body that we weren't talking about? We don't need to know, you know, the minutiae of how to get, you know, extra milliseconds of performance out of women before we actually just treat women's bodies as women's bodies and understand they've got menstrual cycles and that their symptoms might be holding them back, or they've got pelvic floor issues that could be, you know, increasing their injury risk. Or until we get the basics right, it's almost useless having advanced research into how to prepare women for peak performance, because we're not even doing the basics right.
In a panel discussion on racial inclusion in women's sport, Garnet McKinder, diversity lead at Sport England and a former Prem 15s rugby player, shares her personal experience of finding rugby, before the ECB's Shruti Sorjani highlights her learnings from taking cricket to women in South Asian communities. Finally, we hear from former British Paralympian Anne Wafula-Strike as she highlights the importance of how we talk about women's sport.
Personally, my story, how I got into rugby, I think I was lucky. We didn't get offered it in school. It wasn't a sport that was on my radar at all. And it was a coach that came to our school, ran a taster session just for the girls. I absolutely loved it, and it kind of went from there. So whilst I guess the pathway was really inclusive and the door was open, if you don't know it's open, then you're not going to walk through it. So I think it's really important to get that outreach, give people those opportunities. And sport isn't for everyone, but if you give someone an opportunity and it's for them, then, you know, it changed my life, and it's a huge part of my life and always will be.
Shruti, you've done so much fantastic work at cricket, clearly, and others now learning from that as you've kind of shared the learnings that you've had. But I wonder if you can just highlight what are the key challenges that have been faced by South Asian women in terms of getting them started in cricket in that initial at the grassroots level.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump on the back of Garnet on this. But to, as she's rightly highlighted, like, you don't know what you don't know, and them opportunities. what we found that with the communities we were engaged with, they just weren't aware that cricket could be a viable option for them to volunteer, play, or even have a career in. So it was about how do we raise awareness that sport can give you so much, whether it's playing, whether it's making friendships, physical, mental health, the benefits of that, or even just being a part of national and local community. So awareness is huge, and also ensuring that what you're offering is right for them, not just a off-the-shelf product that you feel that's going to suit everyone. And that's where that intersectionality comes in, because what someone might need in Birmingham might be different to what someone in London needs, for example. It was about making sure we took cricket to their doorsteps. So we know, like, having a safe environment, the travel distance between like leaving their home and going to a safe place was really key, because there's so many things happening outside of sport in the world that we live in as well. And safety was like a high priority. So just making sure that where they were coming, the environments were safe and they felt comfortable. Making sure that the sessions we ran, whether they were for the children or the activators that were coming through the door, they were done by people like them. So making sure that they saw themselves in the roles, but again, having females who were there, who were leading the session, was super valuable. And then it's also just around, there's a few women that we engaged with in communities that had various cultural expectations, whether it was family or whether it was other priorities that were conflicting, and sports was always pushed to the bottom of the agenda. So one of the things that we worked on over the past couple of years is, how can this be a lifestyle choice? How can this fit into everything else that's happening? And that's why really building on that bond between mothers and children, or aunties and nieces, and really bonding on that family or friendship experience was key. So it was all about finding different and unique ways to appeal to different people, basically.
Thank you. And I know we talked about that whole going into people within communities, but clearly schools, as you mentioned at the beginning, Anne, that's such a key area of education and schools. So I'm just interested in all of your thoughts, really, in terms of the factors that impact those young women, that peer pressure to whether to get involved with what's traditionally feminine or not, the clothes they have to wear, getting changed in public periods, how any of those things are perhaps magnified for women from culturally diverse backgrounds. I don't know what your thoughts are there, Anne.
That is very, very interesting, because I'll sort of quickly share my story with you. When I started para-athletics, I developed, I want to call it, a very beautiful upper body, toned muscles and, shoulders. But one time I was in the gym and a man made a comment, and he didn't know whether I was female from just looking at me from while he was standing behind. And I thought, oh, that is not so kind. And because of that, I became so timid. I never wanted to expose my shoulders. I always covered up, even when I was training outside on the track. So to me, I feel that the language that is used around female athletes sometimes can put people off, because, for example, if you're playing rugby, you don't want your peers to start thinking, oh, goodness me, she's starting to look different. Or why is she doing rugby? This is something that is just associated with men. But we come from those backgrounds. Most of our parents are from a generation where the only sport you can play as a girl is netball. The only sport that you can do as a girl is rounders, or, something like that. And I think sometimes that's why parents are so quick or reluctant to let their young girls go and participate in certain sports. And this is also based on faith, religion. I have friends who will not play certain sport because they cannot expose certain parts of their bodies. So what do we do to encourage these athletes, and what kind of knowledge or education do we have to help their parents or families to understand how their children can actually come and access sport? We have sort of to find ways where we can actually start to tolerate people, their beliefs, where they're coming from, to know that I can still come and run and still wear a headscarf, for example. We need to encourage safe spaces for young women to come and play or access sport.
Here's Sarah Hunter, England captain and England's all-time most capped rugby player, talking about the importance of young girls seeing strong, powerful female role models. Fantastic that you played and you worked hard to go and find those teams, create those teams. But we do see still, don't we, a huge drop-off of teenage girls in sport generally. How important do you think it is that the work we can do to normalise those images of strong, sporty women for teenage girls?
Oh, it's huge. I think it's absolutely fundamental to stopping that dropout and allowing people to continue on their journey. I think we've broken down so many barriers about what the typical sporty person has to look like. And I think rugby is such a great advocacy of it's a game for all shapes and sizes from all different backgrounds, especially in the women's game. And I think we've got to keep pushing that message. And I mean, social media has its pluses and it also has its negativities to it. But I think it's really allowed, especially ourselves, to become visible and to say, it's all right to play sport. It's all right to have muscles. It's all right to be sweaty and for your hair to be a mess, because there's a time and place for you to be that. And then there's a time and place for you to be however you want to be. It's so important to keep pushing that message that sport is a wonderful thing for the mind, for the health, to be part of, and the values it teaches you. And I think if we can keep advocating that with young, impressionable teenagers who have so many different pressures going on in their lives, so how can we keep being these really positive role models to say that if you love something, just have that courage and passion to keep going with it, regardless of what people may think or say. And that's really challenging for young, impressionable, young women especially. But if we can start to keep breaking down those barriers, we'll be half solving half the problem, really.
The first guest ever to return to the Game Changers podcast, Sally Mundy, CEO at UK Sport, talks so openly about how we change attitudes to gender in sport.
So one of the things that surprised me when I left hockey and came into this role was that I really felt hockey was dual gender. I know I mentioned earlier about people used to ask me, was it women's hockey? But they weren't people in hockey that asked me that. It was people outside of the sport. Hockey always felt truly, truly dual gender to me, and the way that we viewed it was very dual gender. What I have found myself quite surprised by now working across professional sports and Olympic and Paralympic sports is just how much everyday misogyny actually exists, because I wasn't used to it in hockey, and that actually has been quite a surprise to me. So when you ask the question about sort of things like women's sport and people not valuing it, how does it make me feel? It makes me feel bored. It makes me feel frustrated. And we've got to stop saying thank you to people for being interested in women's sport. We've got to stop saying thank you to the media and the broadcasters for showing it. Oh, thank you for the crumbs. Thank you for giving us a little bit of airtime. Well, thank you for giving us a bit of sponsorship. These are incredible athletes who are playing incredible sport and who can't help but get wrapped up in it all. It is fantastic sport. And I think that and I know I have a responsibility in the job that I have, to just stop apologising, stop saying thank you for the tidbits that we get. And I genuinely believe that we are on the cusp with women's sport. And I think there are a number of sports that you've mentioned, hockey, rugby, cricket, athletics, loads of sports who have been doing amazing stuff in this space for quite a long time. We've now got to really make sure that just becomes mainstream.
I love talking to Rachel Pavlou, a trailblazer in women's football, as she reflected on the Euros and why it's so important to recognise the people that have played a part in the growth of the women's game.
Don't I just love that when the girls won in the summer, every one of them talked about the people that came before them, the players that came before them, the administrators, the development officers, the coaches. Everyone felt they were part of it. And there was a moment when I didn't quite believe we'd won, and I sat there and I couldn't help thinking about everybody I'd ever worked with and all that they'd done for us. And we talked today about the male allies, all those male allies that put themselves out there when they were jeered and laughed at to get involved in women's football with us and take us on the journey that we've been today. So while I'm around, we are not going to stop talking about the history and shouting out people's names, because it's never about one person. It's about everybody working together. And that's what the strength of women's football has been, is we've had so many people doing that with us.
And finally, we hear from Shauna Brown, former England professional rugby player, on the role of allies in sport. And Hugo Monnier also features in the film, a former guest on the Game Changers, and there's some really lovely interaction between the two of you. Clearly, he's a big supporter of your career. But when I spoke to him on the podcast, he did say he wouldn't want his own daughters to play rugby right now, as a setup for professional players isn't yet good enough. Does that surprise you to hear him say that?
Short answer, no, it doesn't, because Hugo's a very honest person, and he is within the sort of women's game, and I speak to him personally, and like we have phone calls and chats about things, and it's almost he's getting so on board that me and like other women, when we hear it, these things don't surprise him anymore. Like when we hear about the different standards, and hearing about people who go to work 8-9 hours a day and come to training. So he's now in a place where he's defending it as well, and it'll be on pitch, and someone will moan that, there's like 4 balls dropped in that game, that's disgraceful. These are professional players. Number one, they aren't. But number two, they might have dropped 4 balls, but they've also done a 42-hour working week and come to training. And as a team, as a club team, we get about 3 hours rugby together a week. And as you can imagine, like 3 hours in a week to play Premiership level of rugby is not a lot of time. So, something's got to give. But no, it doesn't surprise me that Hugo's being more and more honest about it, because, when a giant like Hugo speaks, people listen. And this is what we need to encourage more and more people to not only realise that our struggles and our issues, but to say them out loud. And again, just get people at the top who can make these changes and differences, get them listening, because I'm fully in full belief that if they know how bad we have it sometimes, they will want to do something about it. But at the moment, they just don't know, because not enough people are saying it out loud.
Brilliant to hear. And in terms of male allies, do you think the men's game and male players can do more?
For sure. Men and male players can do more, because like rugby is seen as a man sport, and particularly as a white middle class man sport. So there's like so many different angles, even just in that people can make a difference. And, someone like me from Peckham in South London, grew up single mom, went to non-fee paying school. Like just me talking about rugby all of a sudden then puts it into the minds of other people who grew up in a similar situation to me. And that's not necessarily skin colour, that's not even necessarily gender. That could be socio-economic status, that could be sort of single parent status, whatever it is. So just more people talking about issues and situations that don't necessarily affect them directly. So like men speaking up for women is powerful. White people speaking up for black people is powerful. People from fee-paying schools speaking up for people from non-fee-paying schools is powerful. So that whole allyship from all the different angles, I'll happily stand on any platform and talk about women and the equalities that we don't have, and equality of opportunity, more importantly. And it will just be like, like Shauna's going on about women and women's issues again, pipe down. But as soon as a man, any man of any status starts talking about women's issues, it's like, oh, this doesn't directly affect him, and yet he is so passionate about it. Oh, maybe I'll have a little listen in. So yeah, allyship is going to be the way forward.
Thanks for listening. And don't forget, if you'd like to hear more from these incredible trailblazers, you can find the full episodes on all podcast platforms, or head over to fearlesswomen.co.uk. As well as listening to all the episodes on the website, you can also find out more about the Women's Sport Collective, a free, inclusive network for all women working in sport, and you can register for the Fearless Women newsletter, a weekly review of global developments in women's sport. Do come and say hello on social media, where you'll find me on LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter at Sue Anstis. Finally, if you've enjoyed the podcast, I'd be so grateful if you could do 2 things. Firstly, if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd really appreciate it. And secondly, if there's anyone in your life, at home or work, who you think might enjoy the podcast, please do let them know about it and help us to spread the word about women's sport and the stories of these incredible game changers. The Game Changers. Fearless women in sport.